Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know how this works. You send us interesting studies, articles, that kind of thing, and we dig in to pull out the key knowledge.
That's right.
Today, we're heading over to Italy, specifically the Piedmont region. A listener sent us a really fascinating analysis about a potential transport policy there. We're going to unpack what happens environmentally and economically if they switch their road transport over to electric power.
And the material we looked at digs into two main possibilities. The first one is a bus-only plan. So just getting the public buses fully electric by 2050.
Okay, just the buses.
Yeah. And the second one is much bigger. Whole fleet electrification. That means, well, basically everything on the road, buses, trucks, cars, all electric by 2050.
Right, the whole shebang. And what really caught my eye straight away is how something that sounds like a simple green step forward, well, it actually creates some pretty unexpected ripples through the whole economy.
Exactly. It's not as straightforward as just swapping engines.
So our mission today is to get our heads around both scenarios, look at the economics, the environmental side, and especially highlight those surprising twists. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so the big picture. What's the main headline message coming out of this analysis?
Well, the first thing that jumps out, maybe unsurprisingly, is about scale. The analysis makes it pretty clear that the bus-only idea, it's just too small to really shift the big economic numbers for the whole region.
Right, it's sort of a drop in the ocean, macroeconomically speaking.
Precisely. It might be good first step, sensible even, but you won't see it changing regional GDP or employment figures in any major way.
Okay, that totally makes sense. You can't expect a fleet of buses to transform a whole regional economy. So the real meat of the analysis then must be in that second scenario, the whole fleet one.
That's where the interesting stuff happens, yeah? Going all in on electrifying everything.
So what happens then when you flip the switch and say all vehicles go electric? This is where it gets a bit counterintuitive, right?
It really does, because the first maybe quite surprising finding is that even this huge change, turning all road transport electric by 2050, it actually results in only pretty modest changes to Piedmont's overall GDP.
Wait, really? Only modest?
Yeah. The source material even points to a chart showing projected GDP with this policy versus without it, and apparently the lines are almost identical. Very little difference overall.
Wow. Okay, that is unexpected. I would have guessed a massive shift like that would significantly boost or maybe even drag down the total economic output.
Me too, initially.
So if the total size of the economic pie isn't changing much, where's the impact? What's actually happening?
This is the core finding. The analysis really stresses that the main effect isn't about creating lots of new economic growth overall. It's described as primarily redistributional.
Redistributional meaning?
Meaning the value, the economic activity, it gets shuffled around. It moves between different sectors of the economy rather than the whole economy getting significantly bigger. Think of it like cutting the same pie, just differently. Slices change size.
Okay, economic reshuffling, I get it. So let's follow that chain reaction. When the whole fleet goes electric, what's the very first domino to fall? What changes immediately?
The absolute first thing, and it's pretty obvious, is the energy mix. Suddenly, you need way, way more electricity to charge all these vehicles.
Right. Huge spike in electricity demand.
Exactly. And at the same time, demand for petrol and diesel just, well, collapses.
Naturally.
Yeah.
So who feels that first? Who are the immediate winners and losers from that energy shift?
The first hit is felt most directly by the power companies, the electricity producers, and of course the companies supplying the petrol and diesel.
Okay.
The analysis suggests that the big jump in electricity demand could actually push electricity prices up slightly.
More demand, higher prices.
Yeah.
Classic.
And conversely, with hardly anyone buying petrol or diesel anymore, the prices for those fuels are likely to drop.
So my hypothetical electric car costs a bit more to run, but if I still had a petrol one, filling it up would be cheaper. Okay, what's next in the chain?
The next really big piece is the investment needed up front. I mean, think about it. Every person, every company needs to buy new electric vehicles. Plus, you need charging stations everywhere.
Oh yeah, the infrastructure, huge cost.
Massive. So this causes a huge spike in demand for capital, for investment money, specifically within the land transport sector itself.
Okay, so transport companies need to borrow or invest a ton of money. How does that affect their day-to-day business?
Well, even if capital becomes maybe cheaper elsewhere in the economy, these transport operators are suddenly facing much higher operating costs. They've got these big new assets, the vehicles, the chargers to pay off or lease.
Right, capital costs debt servicing, depreciation.
Exactly. And on top of that, they're paying those slightly higher electricity bills to actually run the vehicles. It's a kind of double hit.
So higher capital costs and higher energy costs. That sounds tough for them financially. How would they likely react? How do they stay afloat?
Well, to stay competitive, the analysis suggests they'll probably have to cut costs somewhere else pretty significantly. And a major expense, often, is labor.
So drivers, mechanics.
Potentially, yes. The analysis points towards the possibility of considerable layoffs within the road transport sector to balance the books.
Ouch. That's a really important and kind of difficult consequence. A green policy potentially leading to job losses in that industry.
It's a definite trade-off highlighted in the findings.
And what happens then if you have significant layoffs in a big sector like transport? What are the wider economic ripples from that?
Well, the knock-on effect could be a decrease in the average wage level across the entire region. More people looking for work tends to put downward pressure on wages generally.
Okay, so average incomes might dip slightly.
Yes. And interestingly, that slight dip in wages across the region could, maybe counterintuitively, lead to slightly lower consumer prices in other sectors. Businesses might have slightly lower labor costs.
So let me recap the price shifts. Electricity potentially up a bit, fossil fuels down a bit, wages maybe down a bit, leading to some other prices slightly lower. It sounds like a complex web of adjustments.
It absolutely is. The analysis emphasizes that these shifts in relative prices, power costing more, oil costing less, forces everyone, businesses and individuals, to rethink things. You try to use more of what's cheap and less of what's expensive.
Makes sense. Okay, we've got the overall picture and the initial ripple effects. Let's maybe zoom in now. How do specific sectors fare in this electric future? Who wins, who loses? Should we start with road transport itself?
Yeah, let's. As we kind of touched upon, they face that double whammy, paying more for electricity and dealing with that huge surge in capital investment for the new vehicles and chargers.
How about the composition?
The analysis suggests that unless there's significant public support subsidies, maybe the actual economic contribution of the road transport sector, its value added, could actually shrink by 2050.
Shrink, even with all the new tech.
Mainly because they might have to cut payroll so much to stay profitable. Value added, just to clarify for listeners, is basically how much a sector contributes to the overall economy, its output minus its intermediate inputs.
Got it. So a potentially shrinking transport sector value, which is concerning. What about the flip side? Electricity generation and the grid. They must be doing well with all this new demand.
They definitely see their sales volume go up a lot, and they might get slightly better prices for that electricity too. So yes, their value added is projected to increase, though maybe modestly.
Okay, a win for the power sector.
Oh.
But wasn't there a catch? Something about...
Yes, the green policy irony, as the analysis puts it. Here's the thing. In Italy, when you need more electricity quickly, that marginal demand is typically generated by burning natural gas.
Oh, right. So more electric cars means?
More natural gas being burned, at least initially or without other changes. So demand for gas actually goes up even as you get rid of petrol and diesel cars.
Wow. That really hammers home the point that you can't just electrify transport in isolation, can you?
Absolutely not. It highlights the critical importance of decarbonizing the power sector at the same time. Electric vehicles are only as green as the electricity that powers them.
A very crucial point.
Okay.
Now, what about the losers? Oil refineries? Fuel distributors? It seems pretty clear what happens to them.
Yeah, it's not great news for them in this scenario. They essentially lose their main customer in the region, the entire road transport sector.
Vanish market, basically.
Pretty much. So a big drop in their local sales. However, the analysis does note a potential small silver lining, maybe. With demand falling, the market price for refined fuels like diesel might drop a bit.
Oh, so maybe someone else benefits.
Exactly. Other industries that still use those fuels could potentially get them cheaper, which might slightly cushion the blow for the refineries if they can find other buyers, maybe export markets or other industrial users.
Interesting. Always these knock-on effects.
Yeah.
What about general industry, like manufacturing, construction? How do they fare?
It's a bit of a mixed bag for them, but potentially positive overall. Initially, they might benefit if wages dip slightly, as we discussed.
Cheaper labor costs.
Right. And then later, they also benefit from those slightly cheaper fossil fuel prices if they use them. The analysis suggests this could make them more competitive, maybe leading to more foreign orders.
Okay.
But then if they get really busy, they might hit capacity limits and prices could eventually creep up. But netting it all out, the projection is for a small increase in value added for industry by 2050.
So a slight net positive for industry.
Okay.
What about the massive services sector? Shops, finance, healthcare, all that.
According to the analysis, the services sector feels the effect of wage changes more than fuel price changes. Labor is a big cost for many service businesses.
Sure.
So if regional wages dip slightly, service prices might edge down marginally. But overall, the impact on demand for services seems pretty minimal. It looks like the whole transport electrification doesn't really cause major waves in the services sector's overall economic contribution. Almost negligible, the analysis says.
Okay, so services are relatively insulated. Lastly, agriculture. You mentioned tractors often run on diesel. How does this play out down on the farm?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Agriculture could actually see some benefits from the cheaper diesel.
Because demand from transport has fallen.
Exactly. So farmers running diesel tractors and machinery might see their operating costs go down. Plus, if regional wages are slightly lower, they might be able to afford to hire a few more workers.
Cheaper fuel, potentially cheaper labor.
The analysis suggests this could lead to slightly softer prices for farm products, maybe boosting demand a little, and result in a small overall increase in agriculture's value added.
So potentially another surprise winner in a small way. Okay, that's a fascinating tour through the sectors. Let's pull back again to the big regional picture. We said GDP doesn't change much overall. What's the summary of the macro situation?
The main point holds. Overall, GDP is remarkably stable. But underneath that stability, there's significant churning. The potential downward pressure on average wages from transport job shifts is probably the key socioeconomic concern.
Right, even if prices are stable, falling wages aren't politically easy.
Precisely. The analysis mentions needing a just transition package to handle that. Price-wise, you get slightly pricier electricity, cheaper fossil fuels, but other effects seem to cancel out, leading to fairly stable overall prices. And the overall cost of capital in the region also stays pretty stable as the huge demand from transport is offset by potentially lower demand elsewhere.
Okay, and environmentally, summing that up for the region.
Big reduction in local tailpipe emissions, cleaner air in cities, definitely a win. But as we discussed, that's partly offset climate-wise by the increased emissions from gas power plants needed to meet the extra electricity demand.
Right.
So the analysis is really clear. The actual environmental benefit heavily depends on cleaning up the power supply itself. Otherwise, you're just shifting the emission source and maybe increasing dependency on imported gas.
Which brings us squarely to policy implications. Based on everything this analysis shows, what's the key advice for policymakers thinking about this kind of massive transport electrification?
Several key takeaways. First, absolutely crucial. Tackle power sector decarbonization at the same time as transport electrification. They have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, you undermine the climate goals and risk energy security issues.
Makes total sense.
What else? Second, you absolutely need programs to support workers who might be displaced from the transport sector. Think wage support, retraining for drivers, mechanics, helping them transition into new green jobs or other roles. That's vital for fairness, the just transition.
Okay, support for workers, got it.
Third, consider ways to ease that huge capital burden on the transport sector. Targeted subsidies, maybe government-backed leasing schemes for electric vehicles and chargers. This could help prevent some of those job losses by making the transition less financially painful for operators.
Financial support for the transition.
Right. Fourth, think about equity, especially rural versus urban. If diesel gets cheaper, farmers might be tempted to use more of it, undermining the goals. So policymakers need to consider that. Maybe things like carbon pricing that include agricultural fuels or mandates for renewable diesel.
Ah, the unintended consequences again. Need to watch those.
Definitely. And finally, the analysis basically says don't expect big macro changes from just doing small pilot projects like bus only. They're useful for testing tech, sure, but for real economic or environmental shifts, you need to go big, but also be prepared for all these complex effects.
Wow. So it's a much, much bigger and more interconnected puzzle than just swap petrol cars for electric cars. If you had to boil down the absolute core finding into one sentence for us.
Okay, let's see. Electrifying Piedmont's entire road fleet has a surprisingly modest overall economic impact, mainly shuffling value towards power producers and away from transport workers, and its green credentials really hinge on having a clean electricity grid to back it up.
That sums it up perfectly.
Yes.
It's a fantastic example of how even policies that seem targeted at one area can send ripples, often unexpected ones, through the whole economic system.
It really underscores that interconnectedness.
Absolutely. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about looking beyond the immediate goal of any policy and considering all those knock-on effects. And here's a final thought to leave you with. If completely overhauling a huge sector like transport only results in these kinds of modest overall economic shifts and complex redistributions, what does that tell us about the sheer scale of change needed to tackle even bigger challenges like climate change across the whole economy, and how vital it is to try and map out all those dominoes before we push the first one?
Food for thought, definitely.
A truly fascinating deep dive today. Thanks so much for walking us through it.